Our next speaker is Carole Levesque from Université du Québec à Montréal. Carole, la parole est à toi.
Merci. Merci Thomas Bernard. Bonjour tout le monde. Encore une fois, je suis désolée de ne pas être là, mais je pense mieux vaut ne pas vous rendre tous malades. I hope this will all work. I'll get my time, someone's coming in. All right. So as Thomas Bernard told you yesterday, though our respective works revolve around different projects and different practices, we both meet on the method of documentation and inventory as design project. Both our practices consider drawing as a project or as an invention of a possible world, and both of us investigate our subjects through the practice of drawing. We learned yesterday that Thomas Bernard is fascinated by rest stops, so let me tell you what fascinates me. So for several years now, let's say 12, just a second. There we go. About 12 years, I have been working around the terrain vague, abandoned areas, if you will, walking, documenting, and drawing them because they are simply fascinating. They are both the memory and the future of the city, yet they are disliked and excluded from our daily experience. But while they may appear as withdrawn from their expected productivity and appear as a counter-image of the aimed-for standardized ideal city, they call into question the processes that led to their neglect, as well as those processes that may now be used to take advantage of their apparent availability. They propose a landscape where spontaneity, wilderness, and uncalculated transformations force two seemingly unreconcilable discourses, the informal and the normative, to accept their coexistence and codependence. So I guess what I am interested in is their state of ambiguity, allowing our understanding of the city to be flipped upside down. One of my aims has been to give them a representation worthy of their value, to give them a presence that could allow them to be looked at differently, with curiosity instead of disdain or fear, so that this representation might open the possibility, to a small level, of considering the terrain vague as something to consider when thinking about the city. The only way to get to know a terrain vague is to go to it. Maps leave them blind, and aerial photographs make them look like large stretches of green grass. So I have developed over the years a method of in situ documentation, which requires long hours of walking, thorough photographic documentation, survey, plants and objects collection, video and sound recording, all means possible to capture every bit, every detail of each terrain vague I encounter, so that I am eventually able to draw these terrain vague properly. Just to give you a sense of the scale a project may take, I did a cross-section survey of the terrain vague landscape in Montreal a few years ago, for which I walked across the island for 42 hours over 6 days, photo documented 120 sites, surveyed 12 of them in great details, recorded a 3-minute movie on each of them at each season for a total of 144-minute movie, collected 75 objects and 90 plant specimens, which were then dried and identified, to eventually be able to draw 6 landscape elevations, which, when put together one after the other, present a form of cross-section of the island. So I would say what fascinates me is the terrain vague, but I might also say that what obsesses me is the accumulation of details and the possibility of playing with these details to tell an alternative story of places that seem like they had nothing to say. The literature around terrain vague has been fairly prolific over the past 20 years. Or so, and one reference comes back inevitably. In 1994, Ignacy Sola Morales presented at a conference at the CCA here in Montreal a contribution which would be published the following year in Any Place, titled Terrain Vague, where he proposed that terrain vague was the best expression to name abandoned areas in the post-industrial city, and that terrain vague were an urban condition that reflected our discomfort with strangeness, as if it showed our incapacity to reach our relentless efforts to build a perfect city. Following Sola Morales came many authors, architects, and artists who paid close attention to the terrain vague, trying to grasp, in a way, its true nature or a better definition. Here is a non-exhaustive list of authors since Sola Morales and the different terms they propose, trying to zero in onto what the terrain vague truly is. All of these authors reference Sola Morales, and a few of them go as far as saying that Sola Morales invented the expression. But Sola Morales did not invent the expression, nor was he the first to see within this urban condition a place from which to question or analyze the development of the city. If we go back to Sola Morales as a pivotal point and we look backward in time, we begin to find examples in cinema, in photography, and literature where the terrain vague is clearly used to describe exactly what Sola Morales was talking about in 1994. The earliest use of the expression in literature seems to be from Chateaubriand in 1802, where he describes a fallen monument he visited while in Greece. But if we look at dictionaries of Old French, we find examples as early as 1250 of the use of the term as is, or in some variation to describe derelict houses, land that should be built on, or land that is not in the care of a landowner and is left to poor farmers for their cattle to graze. So after having drawn the terrain vague extensively and gone thoroughly through the literature, I came to think that I ought to find the origins of the terrain vague to define the set of figures to which all terrain vague could be related to. To achieve this, I had to find the archetype and build from there. Oh, I'm sorry. My phone went over my computer. So I kept looking back in time, digging into early urban representations, which of course led me to Rome and the invention of landscape as a pictorial genre. I won't go into details here, but we know that landscape first appears through the windows of Flemish paintings to eventually come as a genre of its own in the 16th century. The entry paysage will appear in the late 17th century French dictionaries to eventually be defined by Diderot's Encyclopedia in 1750 as a depiction that includes uncultured and uninhabited land. There thus seems to be a very close connection, I would even say a reciprocity, between what we would consider a good landscape and the terrain vague. At the same time as paysage was emerging as a pictorial genre, young aspiring artists went to Italy to learn from the masters and found their way to Rome. The city they found was much different than its glorious times of antiquity. Rome was drastically reduced in size and number of inhabitants, most of whom were settled around the bend of the river, leaving a large section of the once thriving inner wall city to what had become known as the disabitato, a vast area described as dangerous and where ruins were overtaken by nature. Filled with vine-covered ruins and tucked between the city and the disabitato, the Roman Forum was, from the 8th century on, deserted, and I quote, deserted, a wasteland, victim of the malice of fortune, as would describe Poggio Bracciolini in 1448, and would have to wait nearly 800 years before its first significant revival. The converging of landscape and its representation, the receding of Rome, and the decrepit state of the Roman Forum, now on the outskirts of the city, appeared to me as the archetype I had been looking for, as an important collaboration between what would become our appreciation of what makes a good landscape and what could be called a terrain vague as two inseparable elements. I inventoried an important number of drawings, engravings, and paintings of the Roman Forum, from its earliest representations in the 16th century all the way to the mid-19th century when serious excavations began, And through making this inventory, it struck me that many artists, aspiring as well as established ones, over 300 years, represented the Forum from a very similar point of view, that is, from the Capitoline Hill, looking towards the Colosseum and the Disabitato. In other words, a good number of artists were engaged in thinking about what makes for a good landscape, while sitting at the edge of the city, looking towards the uninhabited and over the fallen center of the Roman Empire. So I went to Rome in the fall of 2019. Michael, little did we know we were there at the same time, to draw this archetype in its current state. Of course, one wouldn't call the Roman Forum a terrain vague anymore, but I wanted to find its terrain vagueness, if you will allow me, through drawing, and place myself as humbly as possible in dialogue with all these artists who sought to find a good landscape amongst the wasteland. I inventoried the monuments and their location in the different paintings, and went on the Capitoline Hill to draw these monuments in their current state. As I did for the Montreal project, I first spent many hours roaming around the site so as to document just about every stone, plant, animal life, so that I would have details to fill in a way, the space between the monuments, not with the current archaeology or touristic site, but with the natural life that still grows despite the tourists and archaeologists. To make my drawings, there is first the inventory of the monuments, which allowed me to go on site and produce this very small sketch to place the drawing. And with this initial sketch in hand, I then produce a slightly larger sketch to figure out the scale of the main monuments. And from that, I prepare a third sketch, this time to the scale of the final drawing, and also starting to include the details of the in situ documentation. To do that, I project photos that I have taken on site onto the paper so as to get the right proportions for each element of the drawing, which requires a great deal of time just to place the projector at the right distance, height, and angle so as to correct the sometimes skewed perspective of the photos. I then draw a grid of 10 centimeters on the sketch as well as onto the final drawing paper so that I can reproduce the sketch on my drawing. I am then left with an intricate graphite drawing that I patiently fill in using a rotring pen with a .25 nib. The drawing becomes filled with plant and animal life, thriving at their own scale through monuments so that multiple landscapes can be found within the one drawing. I work on my drawings mostly freehand and in compositional terms in the same way as I would a building facade, that is, seeking a balance between masses, voids, openings, densities, and proportions. I like the drawings to be large enough to require stepping back to see the whole and detailed enough to require coming almost nose to nose with the drawing to grasp the smaller elements of the composition. It becomes a matter of looking at the drawing as if walking in the real world between near and far. This movement is also found in the very construction of the drawing. Details accumulate, accidents occur, and I try to find how the drawing can finally build an experience similar to that of wandering. It becomes for me a question of dissolving the homogeneity of reality into a multitude of details, to reassemble them in the drawing and recompose a rich and coherent landscape. I also make these drawings as elevations, devoid of any perspective. It is only through the change of scales and density of ink that depth appears and that the illusion of looking through a landscape becomes apparent. By eliminating the perspective, I also eliminate the ideal point of view, leaving the viewer to wonder what might be behind or what might be revealed if one looked sideways. The similar method of documenting and drawing an infrastructural waste landscape. I followed the Claudia Aqueduct for a 10-kilometer stretch from the outskirts of the city to the Palatine Hill where it ends adjacent to the Roman Forum. Completed almost 2,000 years ago, pieces of the aqueduct are still in place today and generate, as they did through the centuries, different kinds of informal use in terrain vague, from large open spaces to the city and to the smallest terrain vague imaginable. So again, I walked the 10-kilometer stretch about a dozen times, photographed just about everything on my way, made a list of elements that define the experience of walking through this landscape, went through the different stages of sketching to finally transfer everything into a final drawing. This time focusing obviously on the city to the larger landscape. So here are a few details. I don't think this drawing is the one you have in the room right now. For the third drawing, I spent, again, lots of time walking around and over the Monte dei Cochi in Testaccio, which was used as a dump site in antiquity. Boats would stop at the Testaccio port and unload amphoras filled with oil. The oil would be poured into smaller containers so that it could be carried into the city, and the amphoras would be broken into pieces and piled to mount a 35-meter high hill. It's estimated that somewhere around 53 million amphoras were piled there. Over the centuries, tunnels were dug for wine cellars. People settled around and in it. It was even used as a cannon bombing test site in the 19th century. So it is through informal use that the Monte dei Cochi survived and is still there today, with a mixture of small businesses and abandoned buildings and tunnels, and a few roaming roosters as well. So again, same method, lots of walking around and over, documenting, making sketches of what seems to be the most prominent aspects, the composition, different sketchings, to eventually come to the final drawing. Here are a few details. Just go through these and the drawing. So these three drawings bring me to this proposal. Terrain vague happened by la force des choses, that is, things just happen. People leave, a pandemic or a natural disaster strikes, and slowly things decay over many years until we realize it has turned into a terrain vague. It may also come out of pure disinterest. Infrastructures do that. It doesn't matter what happens along the infrastructure, be it an aqueduct or a highway. The infrastructure needs to pass through with complete disregard for the landscape, and terrain vague are created along the way. Or prolonged informal use maintains the state of vagueness, so as no one really wishes to settle, nor is willing to displace those who make use of it, and the terrain vague endures. I will leave you with this little sketch as the beginning and the next step of these Roman drawings. As this project moves along, I hope to demonstrate that the terrain vague is a condition worthy of being in our cities, and that it should not be considered as a second-hand landscape. Thank you.
Merci,
I
Carole.
believe there's a drawing in front of the room, so if you want to have a closer look, feel free to get up.
We cannot miss it. It's there. Yes, Nat has a question.
Thank you, Carole. That was absolutely stunning and really amazing drawings. It's not really a question, really a comment, but the nature of the flattening of the drawings gives them a very theatrical character, a little bit like stage flats, and this just seems very appropriate to the idea of a stage where many things might happen. Thinking of, for instance, of Constance terrain vague, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what else it is about the drawings that are particular to this sort of availability of a territory.
Okay. I'm not sure I understood well because the microphone is linked to the other Zoom, so it's very echoey for us in this Zoom. So if I understand, you're wondering about the terrain vague as being a stage for things to happen in it?
Your drawings appear very theatrical, very stage-like in the sort of flat projections that you set up.
Yes. So the
And
drawings being the stage or
yes,
stage like. Yes. Well, I've been drawing like this for quite a while now. I thought really long and hard about how to draw these spaces because I've always wanted to achieve drawings that would be filled where there would be no space available to imagine what else we could put in them, because these terrains vagues are usually considered as empty, of devoid of any kind of structure, whatever. And so it was very important for me to develop a way of drawing them where they would look full, and they would also not allow us as architects and designers to immediately project ourselves in these spaces and see what we could build in them, how we could fill them. So that's the one thing. And then as I mentioned during the presentation, the drawings really come out of my experience of being in them, of walking long hours these different places. And it was important for me to find a way to draw them that would entice the viewer to, I guess, imagine this experience of wandering. And so if it had been drawn in a perspective, this wandering wouldn't be possible anymore, because I would tell people this is how you're supposed to look at this drawing, or how you're supposed to look at these places. So by doing the stage like, where things are behind and in front of each other and change scale and all this, there isn't I try to get rid of the clarity of how to look at these things. And so that's why, if of course it's a drawing, so even if you look sideways, you're not going to see through things. But I try to create this impression that perhaps there's something that the drawing is not giving you. There's something more behind things. So I guess in a way it's a theatrical trick. Yes.
And hope you get better soon.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Carole, thank you for an exceptional presentation and for everything you've done for the symposium and to set it up. I've been struck over the last day and a half about questions of framing or cropping or occluding the outside, let's say. And in your work in particular, I'm really interested in the itineraries, walking, capturing things which are seemingly difficult to frame, let's say. And I wonder if you had a thought about the outside, the outside of the world which you've drawn, because it seems like it's sort of a gathering table. The drawings seem to be a kind of gathering table that take all of the orphaned pieces which you've experienced and are outside of a plausible stage. It's related to Nat's question or observation a little bit about the theatricality of things and the setting of it, and the.
So I guess it would. So if I understand well, it's where do I cut and why do I cut there? Okay.
It's a technical question. It's a conceptual question that interests me
Yes.
in terms of the way you've set up the discipline, days and nights, and things which are a long distance away and things which you're scrutinizing from as close as your focal lengths will allow you to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I try to. I play with scale a whole lot. As you probably noticed in the drawings, birds are usually really like monster, or I think you have the form drawing in front of you, and the lizards are like Godzillas. And so I try to play with scale so that the perception of the drawing is kind of throws you off a little bit, and trying so that you have to reconfigure the landscape for yourself and placing things back at their own scale. But it's also, as I was saying earlier, it's really an effort to fill in the drawing with as many details as possible, so much so that there are things that I know are in the drawing, but I can't find them anymore. I don't know where they are. And I find this well, it's kind of fun for me so that I have to rediscover my own drawings. I have to re-wander through them. Um, but it's also a way of showing that these places, devoid of interest and just empty, when you start looking at them, they're filled with life and with hues and with people and with all sorts of things that we don't imagine take place. And so the drawings are really trying to grab this life that's only visible if you pay attention and you stop to take the time to look at them. And I think one of the reasons why they look kind of rigid, I guess, in a way, um, or they're very straight. um, Probably just comes from learning how to draw architecture by hand. But also, I didn't show any images of an earlier project, and I did in Beirut, where, and this is really where this type of representation took shape, where I wanted the drawings to be really confined, because the urban space is really confined there. Like, you don't get to see a whole lot of sky in Beirut ever unless you're on the sea. And so all these drawings, all the way to now the Rome drawings, are sort of a progression of this initial project in Beirut, where I wanted things to be really framed. And I do this because they were much smaller drawings. And so from one series to the next, they evolve, they get bigger. Yeah. And I have a plan of making a drawing that will probably take me 4 years to draw on my next round.
Exactitude in science, the Borges one, where the map and the territory and the, yeah, that.
Thank you, Carole. Insane drawing. I mean, it's just kind of great to see it here in its physicality, because we have such a different relationship to it that you've actually described already in terms of our depth of getting sucked into the density of the mark making that you've put forward. So I have three kind of interrelated things, and I can't quite totally put them all together, but maybe I'll just ask them and maybe you can. The first is the combination of landscape with elevation, which is just a weird combination in and of itself because of so many ways in which we've tried to deal with the representation of landscape. Elevation, in its sort of traditional orthographic relationship to the building facade, has usually been one that has the landscape has resisted. And so there's something really unique and I think exciting and strange about the combination that you've been able to put forward, because it begins to tie the aesthetics of plants in their description and details to the decoration of architectural surfaces. And there's moments in the drawing that bleed us in and out of things that look like vegetation to things that look like ornamentation to things that look like tectonic articulation. And that sort of slippage builds a density that becomes a kind of way in which we peruse the drawing visually that's is the density of an experience of landscape, but given to us with the convention of the orthographic elevation. The second comment is constantly interested in the moments where the wasteland meets the wilderness as two places where architecture is usually excluded, and they are yet still constructs that we make. We draw this line and say nobody can build in Yosemite. We draw this line and say nobody can build here where the test site of atomic bombs were dropped in New Mexico. And the terrain vague as being something that's somehow in between the wasteland and the wilderness, where architecture still exists, but it exists in a relationship that's not that which we usually think of in terms of the relationship between a building and its site, but something that's somehow hovering in between. And, you know, using Testaccio and the mountain there with the kind of endless debris that's been piled over centuries is kind of a perfect site for what you're doing. And it's kind of freaking me out that there's this moment where actually it's full, that the space between the wasteland and the wilderness is already full, and full at the density that your drawing has put forward. And then the last comment, and this is the one I can't quite pull in, but maybe you can help us with it, is just keep it at one dimension of line weight, pulls us into the history of etching and engraving, in a way that's I think really, especially thinking about Piranesi and Rome and the ways in which Rome was consumed through etchings and engravings for countless years. I'm thinking that's on purpose, or maybe it's a kind of aesthetic effect you're interested in, but I think it works extraordinarily well. One line weight only, and that as a way in which to draw interest in light and shade and shadow and tone and detail by density of mark making, and a lot of it is maintenance of kind of stroke direction too, if I'm right. There's a lot of keeping of the verticality of certain strokes, and then the horizontality of certain strokes, and then when we get into the vegetation, it starts to go into all of its sort of movements. So I don't even know if that's a question anymore. But Carole.
I don't know either.
Awesome. I don't know if there's something in there to comment on or think about.
Well, just on it's funny, this is a common, Piranesi is always sort of amongst the first few reference and that people give me that know Piranesi, of course. But I think the smart making, you didn't see the Montreal drawings, like I flipped through them really quickly. But they're very different in the ways that I had drawn them, or they were much more filling in with texture. And it may be that going through all this inventory of paintings and engravings of Rome had this influence, or being in Rome, or I'm not sure exactly what precisely brought this way of drawing for these three drawings. But I was also interested, I mean, we don't want to repeat ourselves all the time, right? So I didn't want to just redo the Montreal drawings in the Roman, setup. I wanted to develop a new way of drawing them, but also drawing all the decorations and all the bas-relief of the monuments demanded quite a bit of, thinking about how to draw this in a way that they would come out in the drawing without having to draw very clear figures, because the stones aren't very clear anymore. So there was a response from my part to the subject that I was drawing that needed to be as fluid as a 2,000-year-old stone. And so the smart making became really helpful for that. And I was telling you about my plan for the super huge drawing for the next project, and I don't know. I might start to learn engraving. We'll see if I still draw with a pen next time.
On va passer à Pénélope. Tu restes avec nous?
Oui, je reste là.
Parfait, merci.